What if you stumbled across a once-in-a-lifetime lifeline of riches, but then realized it doomed everyone? What if you were just doing your job? What if you can't live with the consequences? What if you don't want to know what your father was truly doing? What if the future scared you and made you act irregular? What if you were just a little girl who just got injured at the park? The year is 1990 as Special Agent Mara Forrest looks into the disappearance of Edward Crow, last known whereabouts being the abandoned Crow Country, an amusement park that shut down a few years prior due to a child being severely injured at the park. Mara isn't the only one looking for Edward or even at the park. You have Arthur Mole, a photographer who also ended up sneaking in and then getting injured to take a shot of the supposed creatures. Julie Barron, a lawyer who is here to serve Edward Crow papers on behalf of the Marshall family. Edward's own daughter, Natalie Crow, who was the one to file the missing persons report. James Harrison, the officer Natalie talked to about her missing father. Tolman, an engineer that works under Edward. And Marvin Trumbull, one of Edward's business partners. The best place to start a search is obviously Edward's office, but with this being your traditional horror game, everything's locked, requiring different colored keys, flamethrowers, and the usual keypad codes, alongside pretty straightforward puzzles, minor backtracking, but also creating shortcuts and holding off otherworldly enemies. In the meantime, we'll learn the history of Crow Country as well as that of Edward Crow. The area Crow Country was built on used to be called another name before Edward's father bought the land. Edward and his father would visit from time to time, and on the last visit they discovered growing green vines that held gold inside of them. After this, Crow Country would be built and the land would be inherited by Edward, using the amusement park as a cover-up to harvest gold. This is where Marvin Trumbull comes into the picture. Harvesting that much gold is going to look sketchy, especially when based in the US. So Edward thought of this bright idea to buy a gold mine in Brazil and had Marvin manage it. The goal was to harvest the gold here, create ores here, and then ship them out to Brazil as if they were found there, allowing him and his partners to profit more money and avoid the US government. However, it wasn't as well thought out as he had hoped, and the government began asking more questions and investigating more. It also didn't help that it was around this time the incident happened. Elaine Marshall was visiting Crow Country with her family when she wandered off, and ended up in an area that she shouldn't have been at. There she encountered something or someone that left her injured and was admitted to the hospital soon after, leading to the closure of Crow Country and also the disappearance of Edward Crow. The Marshall family ended up suing Edward and Crow Country, wanting Edward to pay for Elaine's hospital bills as it was the right thing to do. Only Edward never did, and that's what brought Julie here, wanting to find Edward and give the papers to him herself and help her client. We'll run across Natalie, Edward's daughter, and find out she also hasn't heard from him at all, hence why she called the police. This is the big mystery of the first half of the game. The question of,
where is Harvey Dent?
Throughout all of the notes, Edward is portrayed as the usual corporate tyrant, always more, ignoring the consequences and just seeking profit. But over the course of the game, we get these phone calls that end up being from Edward Crow, meaning Mara is the only person to have had contact with him since however long he's been missing. Each of these calls gets more and more remorseful. He sounds regretful, almost painting a picture of an apology without really saying it. He talks about not really wanting to have inherited this land and regretting his actions to an extent, which brings the second question to the second half of the game. Why? The first portion paints this game as obviously Edward doing sketchy shit and his organization crumbling around him. One of the themes I think this game shows is consequences, in terms of its story. How different people react to it, whether it's being apathetic, trying to avoid, showing remorse, and even having a bit of a breakdown to those consequences catching up to you. You also have things like ignorance, but almost out of love, if that makes sense. Natalie probably knows her dad is doing things, but chooses to stay in the unknown. She'd rather not know what her dad does. All she knows is she cares for this man and wants to see him again. But this doesn't really explain the monsters.
Monsters? They look like monsters to you?
A little before the incident with Elaine, the park had another in what Edward refers to as the guest. While harvesting those green vines, he found where they came from. At the very bottom of Crow Country lies what he calls the pool. The guest, a disfigured humanoid, would end up emerging from it, and had very little, if any, verbal ability. It did end up having enough, and told Edward something that was able to send a chill down his spine, and caused him to become obsessive about the pool. Edward built a cell specifically for this guest. That led to a lot of his employees to question things just morally as well as legally. He would begin studying this guest, and this is where the Elaine incident happens. She stumbled across this room with the guest inside. We come here later with Julie and see that it's been thoroughly scrubbed with bleach, as if to hide what happened there or whatever did. With the pressure from the government and that of the Marshall family, this is when the park closed its doors. And it was perfect timing as more and more guests started to come through the pool. This is where the rumors of creatures sparked and why Arthur was here himself. With each new guest passing through, they started to look more and more monstrous, carrying with them deformities such as stretched bones and sometimes just piles of flesh. As Edward got deeper into the research, he stumbled across something of an infection that every guest carried with them. This is when he dedicated himself to one single purpose: finding a cure. He locked himself down beneath Crow Country, even destroying the elevator up, showing no signs of ever returning to the surface. His room covered in blood, bandages, a blue phone that he used to call us, and on his desk 5 vials of this green liquid. Before meeting with us, he asked us to bring him those, and to do this we leave behind every key item aside from our weapons, which creates this almost nostalgic feeling. And I don't know how I came across this since this game is relatively short and you don't have a lot of time with these items. Maybe it's just me being old, but this is what I felt in this moment. When we finally meet Edward Crow face to face, we see him in this sickly state, barely keeping himself up with spots of red flesh on him, and looking just not in the best health. Edward knew this moment was coming, when Elaine would finally come back to him. This has been heavily teased from the first scene. When Mara is driving to Crow Country, she's reassuring herself on who she is. What's her story? When we first open the trunk, we see hair dye. When James shows up, he talks about his tires being slashed and his badge being stolen. Natalie is surprised that someone so young is sent when she talked to somebody else on the phone. And just from Mara's own dialogue, we can tell she's much younger than what we believe an officer to be, or even, an adult to be. There's a lot of sections where sometimes it feels like a kid way in over their head, and even from the in-game models, we see Mara looks way closer to Arthur than she does any of the adults. With knowing that, or maybe even guessing that, the story feels almost like a revenge story. Mara is here to end things. Natalie makes it a point to talk about that look we have in her eye, that she's seen it before. How coming here with a gun says it all. This is all right before we take the final elevator down. And this is where Crow Country starts going from a good little horror game to a truly remarkable one. Elaine isn't here for revenge. She's here for help, or some kind of answers. Edward knew she'd be back because the infection she has from the guest isn't something hospitals have the cure for, and when he realized these monsters are people. The green vines that he's been cutting and harvesting for gold are actually antennas, and the pool itself is a gateway to our time from the future. They created this time machine of sorts as a way to go back to warn people of this time of the disease that ended the world. And this makes the revelation of all of Crow's people that much deeper. Douglas Pike, a designer behind the park, shoots himself before we can talk to him. And while this may seem as if he just doesn't want to go to jail, it's more because he can't live with the idea of the damage he's done to the world, and basically doomed it. Each time they cut the antennas, they basically sped things up, and doomed our time, making sure no cure was ever found. It's why he does what he does. Consequences and how we face them is a big part of this game, and we see characters affected differently in how they decide to face it. Tolman, the engineer behind the extraction of the roots, doesn't realize until that number clicks. When we first enter the park and before running into Arthur, we see the number 2106. Horror games make us remember numbers, especially when it's 4 numbers. Even the dialogue when examining it talks about it maybe being a code. However, none of the keypads have the number 0, so this entire time you're running through Fairy Tale Town, Haunted Hillside, Ocean Kingdom, and even the Underground, you have this number in the back of your head. For a few, it may click at the puzzle in Tolman's office, but I think a lot may ignore this small detail. There's a TV and 4 VHS, each labeled with a different date, and when watching that video, a letter will pop up that corresponds to the letter to play on the piano. But when looking at what the numbers mean and what they're tied to, you realize it's all natural disasters. And just like Tolman, this is where it clicks. 2106 isn't a code. It's a year. It's the year the world ends. And when Tolman realizes that, he decides he did his part. He can't stop it from happening anymore, and decides to face the consequences. The only thing he tries is to stop us from going down there and realizing what's going to happen. Marvin is the one that takes things the worst. A mixture of the pressure of the government closing around him and that of the end of the world leads to a psychotic break, killing James and trying to stop us from going down further, and even trying to kill us at the end of it. And while I do think consequence is kind of like the theme of the game, the real theme to me, at least in how I see it, is it's okay to both give and ask for help. When meeting a lot of the NPCs, we can help them in some form. We can give directions to where Natalie is to James, let Julian through the door, help him from being trapped, give Natalie an antidote, give Arthur a medkit, and we even ask for help ourselves. Asking Julie to help us with a 2-man puzzle, even having things like in-game tips scattered around, and a slightly infinite ammo thing with hitting the soda machine for ammo, but I like to think of it as this ties into the theme of help. And this brings us to the man who decides to try to do the right thing despite it being too late. Edward Crowe decides to create 5 cures, one for each of the remaining survivors, as he chooses to face the consequences now, needing to know what's on the other side of the pool. And this brings up another key thing in the game with reflection. The 2 main characters are the only 2 to self-reflect. There's a pool we can wash our face in and look into before the final area. Edward does this himself when he leaps into the pool at the end, and we have this quote from the very first puzzle to get the bronze key. This really ties it all together. When Elaine does it, I think it's just maybe a symbol of innocence, being a person who just happened to be here at the wrong time. While when Edward does it, he comes back this gross monster, as if all the things he's done can't really be forgotten despite his final gesture. But again, with everything, this could be a complete reach. I really want to commend the people from SFB Games, because this game starts as your typical old school horror game love letter. It's fun, it has some decent puzzles, because once you reach Edward's final room and wash the hair dye from Elaine's hair, this game carries with it this somber tone that feels incredibly heavy. We make this single promise to Edward that if he comes back through the pool, to finish him. And when it comes to final bosses, there should be this rush of adrenaline, this almost hero-like moment of being at the peak of performance and the final accomplishment. Instead here, it just feels so tragic that we can't keep the promise to Natalie, that this young girl has to kill the man who just saved her, ignoring the bit earlier. It doesn't help that Edward cries out in between the phases, and eventually ending with him bringing his face directly to you and begging you to end it. The game doesn't even end happily. There is no happy ending here, at least right away. It's bittersweet. Everyone who's alive has a cure. We sit as we drink and daylight slowly approaches, and the words fly overhead just like they do when you save the game. We don't know if things are gonna get better, that even if this cures us, that fated day will still approach. Only thing we can do is to remain hopeful.